Hello and welcome to this spotlight session at the inaugural Swan International Conference. This session is going to be making sense of social work's troubled past, lessons from history, and I'm very glad to have Vasilios Ioakimidis, who's a co-founding member of Swan in 2004. He's also the co-author of Social Work in a Political Context. So we're going to have a chat for 30 minutes and you'll be able to post questions at a later date, I'm sure, or get in touch with us if you want more information. So Vasilios, why is it important to study social work history?
Well, yeah, how do we start with that? I think I'd start with an anecdote, something from going back to when I was a student, back in Greece, almost 2 decades ago. And already, from the first semester, the first term when I was studying, our professors at the time introduced social work as a profession that developed in Greece in 1945 without ever explaining the context. And I'm saying that because 1945 was a key year in modern Greek history. And actually, it was a key year for world history because the British intervention just happened that year in Greece, and that triggered a civil war. And that civil war between the communist democratic army and the national army was really the first episode of what is now known the Cold War. And so as students at the time, politicized actually students, we had this genuine question. I mean, how come in the middle of a war, a divisive war, a new profession developed? By whom and why? Was that linked to the Cold War? No one ever mentioned. And it was very interesting, as I said, we kept questioning professors. No one gave us an answer. All we knew when we were students in the 90s was that social work was a very, very conservative profession, almost, dare I say, oppressive. I would say there were some oppressive elements there, very clinically minded and individualistic. We all also knew that I was incredibly anti-intellectual and really influenced from the US. So I started later on as a PhD student, doing my own research and my PhD. And that's how I started being very keen in social work history in general. And what I discovered through my research was that, I suspected that social work was created as part of the Civil War campaign. It was inextricably linked to the political context. It was a new profession that was used as a political tool, as a soft weapon. It was, it attempted really to win hearts and minds of families in regions in the country that were kind of influenced by the Communist Party at the time. Sadly, social work in the late 40s and 50s and up until the mid 60s, I would say, were also involved in this scandalous part of our history, the removal of children from left-wing families and working class families, the creation of military-style child protection institutions, horrible institutions where children were locked up and were subjected to brainwashing, really harsh conditions. And eventually, actually, this accumulated to a whole ring of illegal international adoption. Children were sent illegally to mostly the United States. This history is now being further investigated, but it took years and years for us to start uncovering these historical truths. So that was a time where, as an academic, I realized that, the Greek social work experience was not unique. Complicity of social workers with and collusion with oppressive state policies and regimes was much more common than we knew and than we like to admit. And sadly, the existing official histories that our students are being taught all over the world primarily focus on these social work as a technical profession, as a benevolent profession, politically neutral. And this sanitized approach hasn't really allowed us to consider our colonial legacies, oppressive legacies, or even legacies of resistance. So that's how it all started, and that's why I think it's really, really important to keep studying history.
So the examples you've touched on around oppressive nature and elements of social work, are they part of a broader structural tension, or is it, I suppose that kind of quintessential look at some social workers are just bad, or they corrupt social workers as part of the state, or do you think it's a structural wider thing?
Well, when we started really studying social work history and then sharing those histories with colleagues all over the world, I think the first defensive response is that, well, these things do happen. In all professions, you will find these few individuals, the bad apples. Well, and a systematic study of social work complicity will clearly demonstrate that, the bad apples theory is a myth. It deprives social work from a serious exploration of its own history. It is problematic mostly because it is moralizing as well. It obscures the true nature of the oppressive elements of social work. As I'll explain later, there is, of course, the history of resistance, because it was not, in all this historical episode, it was not all oppressive social work. But yeah, the true nature of oppressive social work consisted of colonialism, as I mentioned already, suppression of social movements, where state policies focused on suppressing social movements. And of course, the third element is the contradictions in the capitalist states and the ambivalence of capitalist states towards the welfare state. So often those three elements were interconnected. But let me give you actually some specific examples. Colonialism has consistently been the main political framework within which social work developed in many countries. Canada, Australia, Latin America, South Africa, or the African continent in general. And again, this was used, that's quite similar to what I described about Greece before. As we know, colonialism there was an element of this barbaric, very visible violence of colonialism. But there was also, alongside this military element and the financial element, there was also what we call a soft approach that involved social work was part of this. And its main mission was kind of perpetuate colonial rule, not with arms and weapons, mostly through social control and the reconfiguration of, let's say, cultural institutions, like including the family. Yeah? How do we change the family in a way that fits our understanding, the colonial understanding? So inevitably, part of this plan was to eradicate native cultures, eradicate cultures that pre-existed, and try to import controlling institutions. So social services in this context really actively try to suppress indigenous cultures and introduce settler values, to native communities. And again, manipulating and reshaping family was the gold standard, and children were really the obvious target. And in Canada, this led to what we now call the infamous Canada Scoops, that originated from the Aboriginal Protection Act. I'm sorry, the Aboriginal Protection Act was Australian, but it was absolutely interconnected policies, and they were notorious as examples because it specifically targeted children and resulted in child removal from Aboriginal families. It is estimated that this practice lasted up until the 80s and resulted in over 4,000 to 5,000 children being removed from families. But another example that is not very well known, because we've focused very much in recent years in Australia and Canada, and the Canadian Professional Association even apologized, as I'll explain later. A less known example is this of Denmark. We very rarely speak about this, and I know that our Nordic colleagues are organizing several sessions of this conference. So I'll be looking forward to hear if this would be discussed. This goes back to the 50s, and of course it refers to Greenland. There was an effort to modernize Greenland through, again, removing children from their communities and placing them with middle-class foster families in Denmark. It was disastrous. This experiment was absolutely disastrous. Generations of children were just being traumatized. And of course, there is another session in our conference about South Africa, because South Africa, when we speak about colonial social work, we cannot really ignore, this is the most extensive and sophisticated example of social work complicity in practices of racial segregation. So again, I'm very confident that our South African colleagues will speak about this in the sessions.
It's interesting you mentioned the Australian. I remember there was a drama on ITV or something like that years ago, and it was about one of the, I think she was like a social worker, but she became a lawyer, and she did the tracing of the families in Australia. I can't remember, but it'll come back to me tomorrow.
Oranges and Sunshine, and I will definitely encourage people to watch it.
Yes, that is it. So what can we learn from these histories? Because obviously they're quite horrific. So what can we learn from them?
Well, yeah, actually, so the reason why I've used these examples, and actually there's multiple examples. As we speak, we're editing a book on social work's troubles past, and there would be literally examples of oppressive social services in all continents. But the reason why we're focusing on these, as I said before, is not really because we want to accuse individuals or undermine our profession, our community, or even morally judge individual social workers. It's quite the opposite, actually. In our work, we have been trying to explore those horrible histories because we need to learn, as you already mentioned, from the mistakes of the past, make sure that we don't repeat those, but also we need to celebrate the social workers who, within this difficult context, an incredibly dangerous context, they didn't collide. They resisted oppression, they resisted state violence, and they sided with the oppressed. So unless we demonstrate the social work, elements of social work, mainstream social work or official social work collided with these regimes, then we will never be able to celebrate our colleagues who risked their lives in many contexts to challenge this. If I had to draw, a conclusion, three areas where I think we need to focus in terms of our learning, and looking back to the histories we have been studying, I would say that lesson number one, every time that social work has attempted to present itself as a technical, purely technical and politically neutral activity, we as a profession always ignore, when that happens, we ignore the well-being and human rights of the people we work with. We prioritize the technical elements of the job at the expense of people's rights. You know what? The get on with the job approach. Don't ask, get on with the job. Still present in managerial social work. This has been the fertile soil for oppressive practice. A lot of these cases happen because social workers didn't question authority, didn't question the managers, didn't question the services when they were being asked to engage with specific practice. Lesson number two, the default position of many social work organizations or employers or even some professional associations was really to, guard, defend, the self-image, the professional status. And again, at the expense of the individuals and communities. And truth is that at times when social work in its history felt the most insecure and had this lack of professional confidence, these were the times where we as a profession desperately sought refuge to dare I say, pseudoscience, from the eugenics, because social workers in the late 90s and beginning of the 20th century, just because they needed to feel like a science, they engaged with the eugenics. Later on, with selectively using aspects of psychodynamic theory, and I'm saying selective because I don't doubt that psychoanalytical approaches can be beneficial and helpful, but being selective about what elements they choose, this can become hugely problematic. And in recent years, we have seen the reemergence of biomedical models, neuroscience. And so let me say academic insecurities sometimes also lead to this. And the third one is a constant need to reassess our political environment. That's the third, generally anti-oppressive practice and radical practice, or good practice for that matter, always requires that social workers are, alerted, assessing the practice, assessing the policies, and engaging with progressive movements, civil liberties movements, human rights movements, and keep questioning. So these are the three main lessons in my view.
I might ask a question before I come on to my next one, actually, because typically as we are all in lockdown, I suppose TV has become quite a prominent thing, and it's very interesting. There's been the series on Woody Allen and Mia Farrow, and within that there was obviously allegations of sexual abuse, and how in America particularly that they've taken on what's the kind of pseudoscience phrase of parental alienation, and how it's one of these trendy catch-all terms that come into it. So I suppose my question is kind of a bit of a statement. It's kind of, as a child, I should say I'm a children's and families social worker on the front line as well, and you still see that we kind of go back to trendy themes and trendy systems or evidence-based programs, whether it be youth justice or various different kind of programs. And where do you feel, I suppose my question is, how does that fit into a historical look of social work? Because sometimes it feels like it negates the kind of history of learning because it comes with a kind of ready-made program.
Exactly. It is really what we said before, one of the three key lessons. I think there is this element of the get on with the job. I think this is evident. You know what? Not only in frontline practice, in academia as well. There are times where, and I can remind you, actually, now I'm speaking about social work education. It was not long ago when the so-called independent report on education suggested that social work students are overly altruistic, idealistic, and that was part of an official report. But if we go back, and that's how this is linked to history, to all the independent reports regarding to social work education in the UK in particular, but that's relevant to other countries as well, much of the world, going back even to the 19th century when the social work, the Chartered Organization Society developed, we'll see that this pattern keeps repeating itself. Social workers need to stop being empathetic. Social workers need to stop understanding families, understand less and condemn more. And this is a continuous pattern for well over a century. So this is exactly the context that social workers should be worried about. And when they hear they get on with the job and don't ask big questions because these are irrelevant, we have a family at risk here, this is a point where they should make these interconnections in their own analysis. And you know what, speaking about history and going back to the 19th century, it is not only the horrible histories that have disappeared from our curricula, it is also the histories of resistance that have also disappeared. suspect that they never made it to our textbooks, to be honest. They didn't recently disappear. And these radical histories exist and existed from the beginning of our profession, right in the middle of the 19th century, not only the UK, globally. And already from the 19th century, we know that the settlement movements in the US and the UK included, those politicized practitioners. And although the progressive nature of the settlement movement is well known and well documented, most people don't know that members of the Chicago settlement, what was the most radical settlement in the States, were not only progressive, actually they were influenced by socialist ideas. Actually, some of them, something again, not very well known in social work, they were in direct communication with Friedrich Engels himself. And they had this correspondence, and the kind, in the sense, they were very proud of their work and showcasing their work to Engels. And they were saying how they developed welfare practice that focused on solidarity, but at the same time, how do they try to unionize the communities, which is a fantastic example of socialist type of radical social work, but an example that has disappeared. And again, in Europe, we had similar developments. Some of the settlement movement pioneers, they had joined forces with the anti-war movement, the suffragettes. They were in touch with Clara Zetkin and Rosa Luxemburg. These are, even within, sometimes I think the radical social work section, we don't know these details. I think my favorite, and I'll finish with that, my favorite example is this of Tyra Edwards, which is an African-American social worker in the early 20th century. And again, she was engaging with the settlement movement. And when the Spanish Civil War broke out, she thought, like, what, the oppression I experienced, Tyra Edwards said, in the streets of Chicago is the similar oppression that our brothers and sisters in Spain are facing by Franco and his fascists. So she left her practice as a social worker in Chicago, and she traveled to Spain, and she worked as a social worker. She used her skills to support children in the Republican areas. And there's this fascinating, description about her speaking to the Republican forces, and then she enjoys a standing ovation, and even La Pasionaria, the communist emblematic figure, goes and hugs her. This is the only example of a social worker that we know that was so much involved in this anti-fascist action. The most emblematic, not the only one, because the anti-fascist movement was really, really developed. So we need to keep those histories in mind as well.
That's fine. I never knew that about the story with Friedrich Engels. That's amazing. So this would be a final question, and it's interesting you talked about professionalism and how things have, I suppose, we're at a period in time where we've got pandemic, we've got economic crisis, we've got lots of crises. Poverty is still growing. Where I am in Scotland, poverty has been a major problem for many decades. Then we've got all these histories and X, Y, and Z. There's so much to take on. So how can we address some of the historical injustices that have happened?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. There's two interconnected areas here. The first one, the obvious. I cannot resist. This academic side of things is about uncovering, truth. Learning from historical research. We need to keep studying our history. And it's not easy. And I know from that many colleagues in different parts of the world, when they try to do that, they will experience attacks because people don't want them to study this history. In Spain, for example, we know that there was, until recently, a law, the Oblivion Law, it was called, that really literally banned research on the barbaric nature of Francoism, literally. And this is only one example. When you try to connect the dots and see the oppressive nature of fascism, authoritarian regimes, they always experience difficulties. So we need to extend our solidarity to these people. How do we do that? Academic research, research with joining up with movements, understanding history of capitalism, histories of social movements. But we also need to include those lessons into our curricula. I mean, I started this interview by using my own example. You know, it was an example of ignorance. This should never be repeated. And actually, working with the International Federation of Social Workers, we recently developed a new standards for social work education. And I'm happy to say that learning from social work's troubled histories now will be a requirement or an aspiration. But it's in the new standards that all social work programs and curricula should engage or should strive to engage with these difficult histories and learn from that. The second element here is keep putting pressure on national professional organizations and international professional organizations and push them to recognize wrongdoings. Canada and Ireland already have kind of apologized for engaging with oppressive practices. But you know what? This should not really be a performative gesture. You know, there's a difference between an apology, and notoriously we know of, you know, Tony Blair even offering an apology. There's a difference between apology and apologetics. This needs to be a political, meaningful process that happens in line together with survivors. You know, this should become a no justice, no peace part of our history. And I know that many national associations will feel uncomfortable because of the professional insecurity I mentioned before, but this is a way of, you know, this will provide the legitimization for social workers at a local level to address oppressive practices. So if practitioners say, you know what, we once apologized for our oppressive practice, we cannot keep repeating that. You know, it gives sometimes the gravitas needed. But last but not least is that this should happen in a way that doesn't scapegoat capitalism. You know, social workers should not become the scapegoats that kind of provide alibi, let's say, to the state and offer them the excuse they need and say, social workers just didn't, you know, they didn't do it right. It should happen in a way that exposes the state violence. And that's why I said it is important that this happens not in isolation, but in conjunction with survivors and movements. And in order for this to happen, it requires alliances. It requires that we put current crisis into the equation. It requires that we connect, we demonstrate the historical, let's say, evolution of capitalist contradictions and linking up with some of the current debates. But I'm very confident our community will grow stronger with this process. And if anything, Rory, this conference is a testament, and the large, massive participation to this conference is a testament that social workers, I think, are ready to engage with past, present, and future struggles.
Thank you so much. So that was really fascinating. You know, even just thinking about the area I work in and stuff, you know, it's a very historical area. And it's actually raised questions about how much has social work been involved in the community previously. And yeah, as a practitioner, you forget, like, actually there's a whole history of social work involvement in this area, and what is that? And what is the community response been to that? So really enlightening, and thank you so much for giving us the time to talk to us. And to everyone else, I hope you're enjoying the conference, and we'll see you at another session.
Thank you, Ray.